webinar on bullying prevention and intervention. This is Jennifer Allison. I'm the director of the Children's Safety Network, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which is the third in our three-part series on findings and recommendations from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's report called Preventing Bullying Through Science, Policy, and Practice. And today we'll be learning about what research shows regarding programs and policies for the prevention of bullying, what kinds of approaches are most effective, and which are best avoided. So before we get into the content of the webinar, I'm just going to go through some quick technical tips. First of all, audio is being broadcast through your computer speakers. And if you're having difficulty getting audio through your computer, call the phone line. Let's see, 866-835-7973 and mute your computer speakers. And then I also want folks to know that you can submit a question in the Q&A box at any time, and we're going to address the questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar after we've heard from our presenters, so that'll be at the end of the webinar. You can also download resources from the FileShare pod, which you'll see just above the slide deck. So the resources that are in there, I just want to point them out quickly. The National Academy's report is up there, and also a copy of the slides for the webinar can be found in that FileShare pod. Then I want to let folks know that we're going to keep the phone lines muted throughout the webinar to prevent background noise. We have around 300 people that we're expecting to be on the webinar today, so we've got a lot of people listening in, which is great. Finally, then we're going to be recording the webinar, and we'll be sending out a link to the archived recording to all those who registered for the webinar. All right, and then I want to introduce our presenters today, Catherine Bradshaw and Dan Flannery. So Catherine Bradshaw is a professor and the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. She's also the co-director of the CDC-funded Johns Hopkins Center for the Prevention of Youth Violence and co-director of the NIMH-funded Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention and Early Intervention. She collaborates on research projects examining bullying and school climate, the development of aggressive and problem behaviors, effects of exposure to violence, peer victimization, and environmental stress on youth, and the design, evaluation, and implementation of evidence-based prevention programs in schools. She's co-authored nearly 200 articles and chapters and collaborates on federally funded randomized trials of school-based prevention programs to improve school climate and prevent behavior and mental health problems. And she's also the editor of the journal Prevention Science, co-editor of the Handbook of School Mental Health, and editor of the forthcoming Handbook on Bullying Prevention, A Life Course Perspective. And Daniel Flannery is professor and director of the Began Center for Violence Prevention, Research, and Education at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. And from 1998 through 2011, he served as founding director of the Institute for the Study and Prevention of Violence at Kent State University. He's also a licensed clinical child psychologist, a member of the graduate faculty of the University of Notre Dame, and a professor of psychiatry and associate professor of pediatrics at Case Western Reserve University, University Hospitals of Cleveland. And Dr. Flannery's primary areas of research are in youth violence prevention, and the link between violence and mental health, and program evaluation. He's the author of Wanted on Warrants, the Fugitive Safe Surrender Program, and author of Violence and Mental Health in Everyday Life, Prevention and Intervention for Children and Adolescents. He's also senior editor of the Cambridge Handbook of Violent Behavior and Aggression and Youth Violence, Prevention, Intervention, and Social Policy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dan, who's going to get us started with the presentations. Dan?
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to be doing the first half of the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Bradshaw to talk us more specifically about school-based programs and community-based programs. But I think it's important to start off by giving the audience a little bit of a background of the work of the committee and some of the major issues that we were asked to cover. As you can see, the committee was quite diverse in background and experience. Our chair was Dr. Fred Rivera, a pediatrician at Seattle Children's Hospital, but we had expertise from the areas of communication and public health and psychology and a variety of other disciplines. And we met over a period of about 18 months to conduct this particular study on bullying and peer victimization. What I'm going to do in the first part of this presentation is really highlight some of the conclusions, the core conclusions from the committee and the report, so that you can really get more information in detail from the actual report. So I encourage anybody whose interest is sparked about this conversation or who wants to read the actual language of the findings, conclusions, or recommendations, or wants to find out about some of the research that backs up those findings, to really take a look at the report. We were really asked to confine our findings to the most rigorous research that was available in the field. So you can't imagine that anytime you take on a study like this, we're sort of taking a snapshot of where we're at any particular point in time. So while there is much that we know, certainly what you'll discover is that there is still much work to be done in this particular arena. The overarching context of the problem that the committee was asked to address is to recognize that bullying is really a public health issue and a potentially serious public health problem, that no longer can we just treat bullying as a normal part of growing up and something that we expect our young people to just have to deal with it. So there is some emerging evidence that whether you're a victim of bullying or a perpetrator or both, then there are some short and long-term consequences to that behavior, not only in childhood or adolescence, but also into adulthood. So we examined quite a number of those different studies. We started off by having to come to some agreement about the definition of bullying. And so the report reviews a definition that was adopted recently by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Education and Justice and others. It really focuses on the sort of traditional conceptualization of bullying where there's repeated instances of victimization and a power imbalance between the perpetrator and the target. But we also recognize that the emergence of social media is a bit different potentially from the traditional forms of bullying between two children. So we were interested in looking at the use of social media and its impact on this phenomena, and we recognize that cyberbullying or electronic aggression, or the various terms that are used, aren't necessarily captured by the same kinds of repeat victimization and power imbalance that you see between more traditional forms of bullying. So this is an area that does require some additional attention. The fact remains that we don't think this is going away, that youth social media use is increasing and predominant and prevalent in all different forms and functions, and the different kinds of social media that youth are using is changing quite rapidly. So we do recognize that there could be instances on chat rooms and through the internet and other various forms of social media where types of bullying can occur, or at least instances that kids would consider to be bullying that may or may not meet the formal definition of bullying that's been adopted in the academic literature. So the committee, the scope of the committee was really try to examine these four main areas. What's the relative scope or prevalence of the problem of bullying in all of its forms? What are the different contexts that affect bullying? Because we understand that bullying doesn't really occur in a vacuum, but that there are various layers and systems and settings under which bullying can occur that affect how someone handles it or its short or long-term impacts. There's also an emerging sort of set of research on the biological or physical consequences of bullying, not only on one's physical health, but also on brain development itself and the neurochemistry of the brain. So we were interested in exploring some of that in terms of what is known with the emerging technology and knowledge about brain development. And then certainly the focus of this particular webinar and the focus of a great deal of attention of the committee was what do we know about prevention and intervention programs around bullying, not only school-based programs, which has certainly been a focus in the literature for many years, but what can we learn from other kinds of programs that may not have been developed specifically to address bullying initially, but might tell us quite a bit about factors related to bullying, whether that's as a perpetrator or as a potential victim of bullying. So those are the kinds of things that the report does cover. So when you look at the data that's available to us currently and national surveys, at least in the United States and in other Western countries, the prevalence of cyberbullying seems to range from about 7 to 15%, whereas when you ask youth to report on bullying that occurs at school in particular, the ranges are from 18 to 31%. The rates tend to be higher for youth that are in vulnerable groups, such as youth that identify themselves as LGBT, or youth with chronic learning disabilities or physical conditions like being overweight. But this is the most consistent kinds of range that we were able to identify from some of the national studies. We also recognize that those rates vary considerably based on the age of the child or based on the definition of bullying that was used in a particular study. But here's an example of some of the different national data sets and studies that we looked at to come up with these rates. Studies that have been funded by the Department of Education, by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and by the World Health Organization, and by the Department of Justice. So these are attempts to look at broad age ranges and diverse groups of young people in elementary through high school, which is where we can find the bulk of our work. While we recognize that bullying can be an issue for children in preschool and emerging adulthood, we did not look at those kinds of the incidence of bullying for those age ranges or particular kinds of bullying in the workplace or among the elderly population. So we really did confine our work to the school-aged population based on the scope of the task for the committee. So this is kind of where we're at with respect to rates of bullying and what we know about how prevalent it is and what forms it's in. We still have these definitional issues and measurement inconsistencies across studies. For example, if you just ask a young person, were you bullied at school today? You'll get one kind of response. If you really ask about the specific nature of bullying using the formal definition of, for example, were you repeatedly bullied by someone, and is it someone that, you know, it has more power than you and that you're afraid of? If you get into that kind of detail of a definition, you'll get a different response rate, potentially somewhat lower than asking a more general question about children who are bullied. We often also mostly ask about whether children have been victims of bullies, whether they themselves were bullied. We don't often ask about kids to self-report whether they themselves have engaged in bullying. And we don't know much about kids who witness bullying and what that means for them as bystanders. And there is an emerging literature on the role of peers in bullying, as well as teachers and other adults in the greater social context where bullying occurs in a school. But these are relatively new areas of work, so it's more difficult to come to firm conclusions about some of these things, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. All things being equal, we really don't have a single consistent set of data that tells us clearly what the incidence and prevalence rate is of bullying by victims or by perpetrators or by bystanders that we can say this is really a nice starting point to determine whether or not those rates are going up or down over time. Again, it depends apart on the nature of the data that was collected, how long it's been collected, who we're asking this information of, and the definitions and questions that are used in the data sets that collect this information. Suffice it to say that there are a lot of studies out there about behaviors close to bullying, like aggression, like violence, but they don't necessarily ask about bullying specifically. So the studies that we're able to, the most reliable and the most robust studies are the ones reflected in this chart from 1999 to 2013. And you'll see that overall, there does seem to be both a steady kind of rate of reporting based on the particular study at hand, but some declines if you had to characterize bullying as going up, going down, staying the same. There is a slight decline in several of the studies that have measured trends, mostly of students who are bullied as victims over time, based on the data sets that we were able to access. If you look specifically at cyberbullying, again, it depends a bit on the definition and the use of social media, and in particular the age group of youth that have been studied. But you'll see rates as high as 23.7% and rates as low as 2.7%. Again, partly depending on the type of question that is asked of the youth and the language that's used in terms of how they ask that question. But you get a sense of the rates of cyberbullying. So there was a lot of discussion in the committee about, is this a unique form of bullying? Is this an increasing problem? Is this just something that we need to pay attention to in the context of bullying? Particularly for school folks, a lot of things happen on social media that are outside the purview of the school, but you certainly have to deal with during the school day. So we didn't want to ignore it in terms of what we need to do. We really understand, I think, in the committee that social media presents a unique opportunity, that you could post something once and that this could essentially go viral, that a lot can be done that's really anonymous. So just in these two sort of contexts alone, it doesn't fit the traditional form of repeat victimization or power imbalance, at least a known power imbalance, and that access to social media is relatively immediate and relatively intense and relatively persistent for most of our young people right now on their cell phones or otherwise. So the work that needs to be done on how we address cyberbullying is just beginning. And Catherine will talk about this a bit later, but we had a much more difficult time identifying evidence-based programs to address cyberbullying relative to school-based bullying because of, I think, the emerging nature of the phenomena and that it's a bit different from traditional forms of bullying. The committee took a social, kind of ecological perspective on what's going on with bullying here to understand that multiple layers and contexts can affect the individual characteristics related to youth and whether or not they're potential targets of bullying or potential perpetrators. So things like race or ethnicity, a young person's sexual orientation, these things can either exacerbate or attenuate the relationship that we see between these things and risk for bullying perpetration or victimization. So it does depend on what type of school a child attends and the racial diversity of that school or the size of that school or their peer group and their peer relationships, etc. All of these contexts do matter in terms of understanding incidence and prevalence, understanding outcomes and impacts, and certainly understanding what we can do with respect to prevention and intervention. So the real question is sort of what are things that are really enhance the risk, and what are the things that contribute to potential protection or competence for young people to deal with bullying. So we understand that individual variables like age, gender, sexual orientation, personality, and social status, these things matter. But they matter in part with respect to your peer group, because bullying in some respects is a group phenomena where multiple peers play a role as bystanders, as potential witnesses and perpetrators. But particularly with respect to schools, you have other adults in the school that also play a role here, and whether or not we choose to intervene and our capacity to intervene. So the context here is important, and particularly important as we talk about prevention and intervention. We understand that the prevalence of bullying, as I mentioned earlier, does increase for vulnerable youth in particular populations. The rates are much higher, for example, for LGBT youth, potentially double in many studies of the rates that heterosexual youth report in terms of victimization from bullying. Youth with disabilities are overrepresented in the bullying dynamic as well. And youth with particular health problems, particularly those that are visible to other young people, like obesity, are at increased risk for bullying victimization as well. So these are particular groups of young people that are at risk for long-term impacts from bullying, but much less is known in terms of preventive intervention programs because very few have been developed to date to really address the potentially unique issues that some of these groups of youth experience. So while we know quite a bit about relative incidence and prevalence of bullying and reports of bullying victimization, we can say that the studies that have been done about risk factors related to bullying, either as victim or perpetrator or both, we're still at the beginning stages of figuring out how these things go together and affect each other. Socioeconomic status, immigration status, minority religious affiliation, etc. All of these things, there are some studies which say these are important issues and other studies that say they're important but only in particular contexts or with particular subgroups of youth. Others saying that there isn't a big deal if there are certain protective factors in place for that young person. I will say that one of the issues that the committee spent a fair bit of time on was the issue of stigmatization and stigma and bullying, with some conversation about what seems to be a bit of overlap between the issue of school-based bullying versus school-based discrimination. There's a lot that we can learn from the research on stigma and its relationship to whether or not someone is identified as a potential target for bullying, but there hasn't been much crossover in that knowledge potential gain. So that people that are talking about bullying really need to also understand the role of discrimination and stigma that can play a role in increasing one's risk for being a victim of bullying, and which eventually is related to your risk for becoming a perpetrator as well. One of the newest areas of research is the impact of bullying and victimization on biology and physical health and brain development. There is some evidence that victimization is related to increased disturbances in things like sleep and stomach aches and headaches. There's even some early work on brain functioning and neurochemistry, which suggests that the stress response system in the brain can be impacted by bullying victimization, and that's related to increased risk of mental health problems or other kinds of issues with emotion regulation and impulse control. And we certainly know from some of the longitudinal studies that have been conducted to date that being bullied during childhood and adolescence has been linked to certain increased risk for mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety and alcohol or substance use even into adulthood. There's a lot of discussion about the role of bullying in suicide and school shootings. And I think in both cases, the committee concluded that while these are related factors, we're not at a point to be able to say that bullying causes suicide, for example. It certainly is related to increased rates of anxiety and depression, and individuals who report high levels of bullying victimization report higher rates of attempted suicides. But there are many factors that contribute to one's risk for attempting or contemplating suicide as a young person. Bullying is certainly one of them. This is certainly also true for school shootings, which is a tragic but still low base rate behavior. So most of the evidence about school shootings comes from sort of anecdotal post-incident psychological autopsying of perpetrators, whether that's young people or now young adults. And so there's more that we need to know here. The consensus is that bullying is a factor in both of these kinds of incidents and outcomes, but there's not enough evidence to suggest that this is the sole factor or not even necessarily the most important factor in each of these kinds of incidents. And then finally, for my part of this presentation, we also talked quite a bit about the neurobehavioral consequences of bullying victimization and the long-term outcomes that this can have adversely for most people into adulthood. That early abuse and trauma and that would chronically activate your flight or fight stress system in your body and the neurochemicals and hormones in your body. This can have negative long-term physical and mental health consequences. And it does matter that young people who are sort of chronically victimized seem to do more poorly than youth who have sort of temporary or occasional experiences with bullying. But the point here is that bullying is, again, not a sort of okay, no big deal, expectable behavior that we should just brush off as part of normal growing up, telling our young people to deal with it and figure it out, because there are long-term consequences for young people, behavioral consequences, mental health consequences, and potentially academic and other kinds of consequences that they have to deal with. So this is the context for the discussion of if these are the things that are important to consider in terms of what we know about bullying as victim or perpetrator, then what does that really mean for our efforts to move towards prevention and intervention? Dr. Bradshaw.
Thanks, Dan, for setting the stage. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. The committee decided to adopt a model of prevention that's consistent with work previously done by the Institute of Medicine and the academies more broadly that reflects this continuum from promotion all the way to maintenance. We're going to focus largely on the prevention elements. Those are the universal, selective, and indicated. But I wanted to introduce this terminology and give a little bit of a background for why we decided to organize our discussion of bullying prevention using this public health framework. And it's largely because of the work that has been done in both medicine as well as public health, showing that you need to be acknowledging different levels of risk and protection that occur within a population. In this case, we're focused on trying to prevent bullying, but there are a variety of other risk and protective factors that are relevant for our conversation around bullying that could very well impact other kinds of outcomes like violence or academic performance. So you'll see that as we move through some of the different prevention programs, not only are they intended to address bullying behavior, but they may very well hit other types of health and mental health and academic types of outcomes as well. On this slide, I just wanted to zone in on those three types of prevention elements, the universal, the selective, and the indicated. So when we talk about bullying prevention, quite a bit of the research has focused on universal prevention programs. And these are programs that might be used in an entire community or an entire school that are not targeted for particular youth, but are aimed to address a broad range of risk factors and strengthen skills and protection among the broader population. When we think about selective programs, these tend to be focused on youth who are at risk for engaging in bullying or becoming potential targets of bullying behavior, and that may be based on their history or their context that put them at risk. Indicated programs tend to be focused on youth that are a little bit more tailored to meet more intensive needs. These are most likely youth who are already involved in bullying, are already bullying other youth, and are starting to display some signs of being negatively impacted by that. One thing that's interesting to acknowledge here, given some of the prevalence data that Dan had summarized, that not all youth that are experiencing bullying actually go on to demonstrate immediate effects. There could be some longer-term effects that show up, or some that are beneath the skin, so to speak, that we may not see immediately. And that's why it's important for us to be thinking about multiple types of prevention, because not all youth that are exposed to bullying will show those immediate impacts, and we need to really be thinking about how we bolster skills and strengths in all youth, so that way, should they be exposed to bullying or develop effects down the road, that they have some strategies to be able to address them. As we think about some of the specific strategies and approaches that are used, the vast majority of the work has been focused in school settings, in large part because that's where youth spend a lot of their time, and it's an important system of care for the delivery of different prevention and early intervention approaches. So with that being said, even still, a large proportion of those school-based programs are at that universal level that may be delivered for an entire classroom or an entire school. These could include a social-emotional learning curriculum that help youth identify and label emotions and help them understand the consequences of their own behavior and develop coping strategies. Most of those programs tend to demonstrate what we would consider modest level of effects, and that there is some variation in effectiveness among certain populations. Not everybody responds the same way to all of those interventions. For example, some of our higher risk youth tend to be more affected by universal prevention programs. And so youth that might have a higher rate of aggressive behavior might be more likely to respond to some of these prevention programs than youth that had a low-level base exposure. And that can contribute to the relatively modest overall effectiveness of programs when we average them across a population. Because of the multiple risk factors for bullying, there's also a need for multiple components. Bullying is a complex phenomena that includes a peer dynamic and a family and individual characteristics, and thus the multi-component programs. And this would suggest that perhaps there needs to be something that's happening in the classroom for all students. There may be a need to include activities that are occurring on the playground and that include parents. Those are some examples of multi-component programs. And the research generally suggests that those multi-component programs are more effective than just a single component in and of itself. The relationship piece is very critical to this, and that includes relationships among students and youth with each other, as well as the connection that they feel with teachers and school staff. That could very well lead to increased disclosure of bullying events. But interestingly, that connection between adults and youth is two ways, meaning that adults that feel more connected to the school environment and to youth are actually more likely to intervene in bullying situations. They're less likely to check out, so to speak, and less likely to disengage from the school environment if they feel a sense of connection and overall responsivity to the school environment. And that level of relationship also extends to include the parent relationship. Parents and youth that talk to each other and spend more time together are more likely to have a context where the youth feels comfortable to disclose bullying. And parents also need to know who to go to in the school to be able to report bullying events and how they can get supports. And there's emerging literature that tries to address certain kinds of strategies that parents can use to support their kids that might be at risk for involvement in bullying, particularly as it relates to cyberbullying. When we drill down a little bit more, looking at some of the other programs and strategies, there's been considerably less research on those selective and indicated, those more intensive programs when we think just specifically about the issue of bullying. There's been a bit more when we look at other forms of aggressive behavior that suggest that some of those strategies may also be beneficial for preventing bullying or preventing kids that are involved in bullying from going on and developing more serious behavioral or mental health concerns. Dan talked a little bit about some of the subgroups of youth that are at greater risk for exposure to bullying and may actually have more problematic experiences as a result of exposure to bullying. That would include LGBT youth or youth with disabilities. Unfortunately, there's been relatively limited research on the impact of bullying prevention programs on those specific subpopulations. So we know little about what to do to help youth that are at those higher risk groups. So we need more research in that area. One area that there has been growing attention to in this field is the issue of zero tolerance policies. And these are typically implemented as automatic suspensions or the use of suspension and removal approaches for youth that are involved in bullying, sometimes referred to as one strike you're out types of policies or three strikes you're out. And while there is sometimes some community pressure to suspend youth that are involved in bullying to show that they're doing something in response to it, we actually have little research to show that those programs are effective. And in fact, there's a growing body of research to show that those programs and strategies for zero tolerance are used disproportionately for students of color and may actually produce more problems than they do offset those problems. For example, a youth that's automatically suspended for bullying doesn't typically receive any services. They're often sent home in an unstructured environment and may actually get harsher punishments from a parent and are losing opportunities for education and instruction in the school environment. Another area where we need to turn our attention is to thinking more about the role of peers and how they can be leveraged in prevention programs. There's a lot of interest in this given the dynamic of peers in bullying. However, some of the research suggests that if they're not implemented effectively, peer-led programs may not be the most appropriate approach in this case, and in some instances can actually make the situation worse if you have deviant or aggressive youth that end up leading those kinds of programs. So we need more research to better understand the way that we can leverage the positive influences of peers as bystanders and interveners and upstanders in these situations, because that's a potentially important vehicle for delivering interventions, but one where we don't really understand all the mechanisms and haven't fully developed evidence-based models. Another area that we have some emerging literature to suggest is effective is the work on positive behavior support and social emotional learning and youth violence prevention programming more broadly. And while there are some studies that have looked at those particular models for bullying prevention, we see that those types of models are reducing risk factors and bolstering protective factors for a wide range of outcomes, and thus may also be effective for preventing and intervening in bullying situations. When we drill down to think about specific models, we summarized a couple of those different models in the report and broke them out to acknowledge where they might be concentrated across different ecological levels, such as the individual, the peer group, family, school, community, and a relatively emerging area of literature focused on the healthcare system as a venue for prevention programming. A lot of the research in the United States has derived from the Olveus Bullying Prevention Program, which was created by Dan Olveus and has been implemented more extensively in Scandinavia and in Europe, and more recently imported to the United States. So many of the meta-analyses have shown some positive effects of that particular model, particularly outside the U.S. And so there's some interest in continued implementation and evaluation of that model within the United States. Another model that's coming onto the radar in the United States is the Kiva anti-bullying program, another import that has come to us from Europe but also appears to be promising. Some of the other strategies, like the good behavior game, focus on improving the classroom management, also seem to be particularly promising for addressing aggressive behavior. These are just a few of the programs that we summarize in the report and that appear to have some protective or beneficial effects. As we move into thinking about some of the other more intensive programs, Coping Power is a group-based program that has been shown to be effective for aggressive behavior and addresses school and family as well as individual supports. And that model likely will have a positive impact on bullying prevention. And then as we move down this list here, you can see a little bit higher concentration of some of the community-based models and family-based models. And while they haven't extensively focused on bullying as a particular outcome, their impacts on aggression and other types of problem behavior suggest that they may be helpful for leveraging in situations of bullying. When we think about effective approaches and components to consider in bullying prevention, these multi-tiered approaches will be very helpful for us to think through. Not only are the multi-component, where you're drawing upon different ecological contexts and different activities that may help bolster protective factors, but also thinking about that continuum of supports, having a universal, a selective, and an indicated system in place within a school, so that way as youth become involved in bullying, that those tiers or more intensive programs are already in place to be able to address their needs within that setting. We could also think about the role of the climate and the culture in the schools that are helpful for us to address. That would include additional supervision and the role of adults in monitoring hotspots and having clear policies that are implemented consistently in the building. The collection of data is also important because that'll draw adults' attention to where those hotspots are and help us monitor the impact of different interventions and policies that are used, involving families to communicate with them about the importance of bullying and what they can do when they see bullying happening, and that way they can know who to report it to within the school building. And similarly, creating that important and close bonded context for adults to communicate with their youth about bullying. And integrating these different strategies with other programs will also be helpful. The report summarizes a number of non-recommended approaches. I already touched on the zero tolerance policies, but there's also a tendency among some adults to think that if we just encourage kids to hit back, that will be effective. However, there is little research to suggest that advocating for violence and retaliation actually stems the violence, even though there may be some individuals that have a personal belief that that's an okay thing. We really want to discourage youth from hitting back. And we talked a little bit about earlier about the role of youth-facilitated programs, but some strategies like conflict resolution that may include peer-led or even adult-led are generally not recommended in these situations because it suggests that there's just a conflict between youth or a disagreement rather than an abuse of power. And while some schools may do strategies to increase awareness, that's an important step in the right direction, but we need more systematic approaches rather than just awareness raising. There's several agencies that play an important part in our recommendations for additional development and implementation and evaluation of programming to address bullying. The research around the policy piece suggests that this is an important piece of the puzzle, but not likely to be the only solution that is needed. We need more research to understand what impact policies are having on the implementation and high-fidelity usage of different evidence-based programs. There is some emerging literature to suggest that those policies may be having a positive impact, but it's difficult to draw a causal link between the policies and the slight reduction in rates of bullying that we've seen in recent years. So we need more research and more collaboration for us to understand what impact these policies are having and working together to try to strengthen their implementation and determination of the most effective components of those policies. In terms of future research, we need more implementation of the evidence-based programs and more focus on issues around implementation fidelity. We need additional attention to the role of peers and bystanders and how they may be leveraged for bullying prevention. We also need to be thinking about other adults that may be involved, like school resource officers or paraprofessionals, because they have a potentially important role to play in bullying prevention, but we need more work in that area. And that's true as well of healthcare providers that could potentially be screening for bullying and using their visits to the doctor's office as a venue for bullying prevention. And we need to be thinking about social media. We spend a lot of time thinking about media as a negative influence on bullying and child development, but it could very well also have a positive influence about changing norms and increasing awareness for bullying prevention. In summary, bullying is a prevalent concern which has a wide range of problematic outcomes for youth. We need to have more consistent use of definitions and application of research to inform the policies and practices related to bullying prevention. And we also need to be thinking more about how we can collaborate with other groups to better understand the dissemination of research on bullying prevention. In terms of some of the work that you can do around this, you can read the full committee report, and you can also spread the word on social media about the work that is summarized in the report. There are some additional webinars, one that already occurred earlier this year that you could access, and you can also look for us at some upcoming conferences such as the International Bullying Prevention Association in New Orleans in November. There's some great resources that are out there. I think a one-stop shop for bullying prevention work is really the stopbullying.gov website. This is where multiple federal agencies have come together to put a lot of relevant and timely information on bullying prevention. There are materials for youth as well as for parents and other adults that can access. There's more information around these, quote, misdirections or programs and strategies that aren't recommended that are available on that website. There's even a video that I helped put together for the federal partners in bullying prevention around this issue. And there's some additional materials around dissemination for different audiences that are being put together by the national academies that we'll be sure to push out, so keep an eye out for those. We did want to conclude by acknowledging the study sponsors that contributed to the support for the development of this particular report. Many of these are federal agencies as well as a few foundations, and the committee is greatly appreciative of their support for the development of this report. And I think that's it. I think we're going to open it up now for questions from the audience members.
That's right. Yes. Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you, Dan. I think those were really great presentations, a lot of very good information. And we do have about 10 minutes for questions here, so folks can go ahead and type their questions into the Q&A box that you'll see on the lower left-hand side of the screen. And we've already got a question that's come in here. Let's see. I believe there was a question about programs for students who both engage in and experience bullying, programs that would help those students in particular. And I think, Dan, did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I typed up a brief response to that question. There is some evidence that the programs for youth who are identified as both perpetrators or perhaps experiencing some mental health or other consequences of victimization, these are the kinds of programs that tend to be placed more frequently in the community as treatment programs. Programs like multisystemic therapy and functional family therapy and others have shown significant effects on these kinds of behaviors and mental health issues. They weren't necessarily developed to address bullying per se, but this is the idea that we do have some treatment programs in place, even though they're not in schools, that can be very helpful in terms of dealing with the bullying problem. We just haven't been tracking that kind of evidence specifically over time because they weren't bullying-specific treatment programs, if that makes sense.
Okay. That does make sense. Thank you. All right, another question regarding what you would recommend to a teacher or a school administrator who wants more information about bullying prevention programs. I know you listed and described some resources that are available, but for someone in a school setting who wants to go more in depth and really determine what kind of program should be implemented in their school, do you have any recommendations for initial steps that they could take?
So one suggestion I have is to check out the resources that are available on the stopbullying.gov website. That's a really nice starting point for a conversation. There's some tip sheets and strategies that are very, very basic that may be helpful for addressing bullying and at least increasing awareness of its problematic effects. Not every school necessarily needs to adopt a, quote, bullying prevention program. I always say it doesn't have to have bullying in the title to actually be effective at addressing bullying. There very well could be other strategies that are more holistic in nature and include multiple components that are aimed at improving school climate that could also be tailored or adapted to address bullying. I talked a little bit about the positive behavior support framework. There's a lot of information on that that's publicly available through the website www.pbis.org. That's pbis.org. That gives some information about different strategies around positive behavior support that can improve school climate and help schools think about a broader framework for adopting evidence-based approaches for addressing climate and problem behavior that might occur in a school setting. Schools may also be interested in promoting a broader set of social and emotional skills for kids and might be interested in thinking about the adoption of a social emotional learning curricula that could be used school-wide or with smaller groups of youth that would be helpful in preventing bullying or addressing bullying-related behaviors that might occur within schools. So those are a couple of frameworks, and if you're interested in a very specific program, we list some of the programs in the report, so you can review that there. There were some on the slides, but I would encourage to consider those kind of broader social-emotional learning as well as positive behavior support frameworks as a starting point for addressing bullying in a school setting.
Excellent, thanks. Very helpful. Got another question from one of our participants about asking whether there's data on the fear of reporting bullying or anything you can say about that phenomenon to help us understand the fear that children experience.
Yeah, I would say that there is some evidence that it's important if a young person believes that an adult or a teacher will actually do something. If the bullying is reported, that's a big deal, that kids who feel like nothing would happen are much less likely to report it. It's also important to understand what happens with that information and whether or not that's going to be quote-unquote used against the reporter. So there are some programs that do have anonymous reporting mechanisms that tend to get a lot of bullying incidents reported. There's a Safe to Tell program in Colorado that was originally set up around school shooter incidents, but many, many young people use that anonymous reporting mechanism, a website and a phone line to report instances of bullying. So I do think there's, that's a big part of the culture of bullying, and whether or not a young person feels that they have the capacity to report it to a trusted adult or other person in authority, and then something will be done to address the problem.
Okay. We're getting a number of questions here on strategies that parents can use to prevent bullying, including cyberbullying. Any thoughts on that?
Well, one area that the report covers is the importance of parents talking to their kids about bullying rather than waiting for it to occur and only reacting, talking about it before it occurs. We often think about having the drug conversation or the sex conversation. Well, maybe we need to also be having the bullying conversation and be thinking about these issues before they come up rather than merely responding. And parents also need to educate themselves so that way they know the research on bullying and that it isn't just a fact of life that every kid must go through or that it's something that makes them stronger. Because a lot of parents and adults kind of are operating on that assumption that they lived through it, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, or that it's a good idea to hit back. So a lot of parents are operating under low information or misinformation about this issue. So we really want to make sure parents are educating themselves first before they're talking to their kids about it. Sadly, there's some research that shows that parents are telling their kids to fight back or telling them that they may have deserved the bullying because of the way that they acted or the way they presented themselves. So we need to make sure that parents are armed with the right information to be able to share that with their kids and be able to have that kind of context in that relationship where kids feel more comfortable disclosing the bullying to them. When we get into situations of cyberbullying, the supervision piece is really critical because parents need to know more about the technology that their kids are using and be able to monitor that. And that's certainly much easier said than done, but parents need to be, again, educating themselves about different platforms that kids are using and be able to monitor them. And it's not just happening on desktop computers anymore. It's much more likely to occur on individual handheld devices like phones, and the importance of sharing that information with parents. So when something does happen that they need to report bullying to an adult at home as well as an adult at school, and making kids more cyber savvy so that way they're also preparing themselves for what to post and what not to post on some of these sites, because kids don't necessarily think that that information could be used against them, but it very well could be. What kind of clothing is appropriate to wear when you're taking a photo, or what kind of photo is even appropriate to post on a site. So we not only need to help kids know what to do when it's happening, but also make themselves a little bit more prepared for how to prevent bullying or preventing themselves from being put in an awkward situation where bullying could occur.
Very good. I think those are all great points. I think we're probably going to have to leave it there. We're just about at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, so we have to conclude the webinar. But I want to say certainly, again, a very big thank you to Dan and to Catherine for your presentations and for your answers to our questions. I think this has been, I've certainly learned a lot on this webinar, and I think it's given everyone some really important information to think about and to work with as we each figure out how we can contribute to the effort to prevent bullying. So I just want to remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded and it's going to be archived, and we'll be sending that link to the archived recording out to everyone who registered for the webinar, so look for that. I also want to call your attention to a very short evaluation form. You can see a link to that on the final slide here. That information will be really helpful to us. We'd certainly appreciate your feedback. It takes just a couple minutes to fill out the form, and we certainly use that information as we plan future bullying prevention webinars and webinars on other injury prevention topics to ensure that the webinars will be most useful to you. So thanks in advance for doing that. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and say goodbye for now, and we'll see you at the next Children's Safety Network webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.